$10 billion. That's the figure at the center of a legal and political battle that is shaking Washington right now. A massive lawsuit has been filed, targeting two of the most powerful financial institutions in the entire federal government, the Internal Revenue Service and the U.S. Treasury. This isn't a minor procedural dispute or a quiet issue buried in legal filings. This is a direct, high-stakes confrontation over money, authority, and the boundaries of federal power. The political fallout is already unfolding, and the implications stretch far beyond a single courtroom. Over the next 15 minutes, we're going to break down exactly what happened, why it matters, and what could come next. Because this is one of those stories that sounds like a headline, but the real impact goes much deeper than most people realize. So let's start with the basics. What exactly is this lawsuit, and what is it actually claiming? At its core, this is a legal action that directly challenges the operations and conduct of two major federal agencies, the Internal Revenue Service and the U.S. Treasury Department. These are not small players. The IRS is responsible for collecting federal tax revenue, the single largest source of funding for the American government. The Treasury Department oversees the nation's finances, manages federal debt, and plays a central role in shaping economic policy. Together, they represent an enormous concentration of financial authority within the federal system. The lawsuit alleges that these agencies have acted improperly, that their conduct has caused significant financial harm, and that the damages resulting from that conduct are substantial. The figure being sought, $10 billion, reflects the scale of what the filing claims has been lost or mishandled as a result of agency actions. Now, it's important to understand the structure of what's being argued here. This isn't simply a request for a policy change or a correction in how these agencies operate going forward. The legal filing is seeking direct financial accountability, meaning the lawsuit is formally demanding compensation for what it describes as improper or unauthorized actions taken by the IRS and Treasury. The court filing itself establishes the legal basis for these claims, laying out the specific conduct that is being challenged and the framework under which damages are being calculated. The parties involved have each staked out clear positions, one side asserting that real harm has occurred and that the government must be held accountable, the other side expected to defend the agency's authority and the legitimacy of their actions. This is, at its foundation, a confrontation over whether these agencies operated within the boundaries of their legal authority and whether the financial consequences of their actions warrant a $10 billion response. To understand why this lawsuit carries so much weight, you need to understand what these two agencies actually do and why they have become lightning rods in American politics. The Internal Revenue Service is, by design, one of the most consequential agencies in the federal government. It is the primary mechanism through which the United States collects tax revenue, the money that funds everything from infrastructure to defense to social programs. That alone gives the IRS an enormous amount of power in the daily lives of American citizens. But in recent years, the agency has become one of the most politically contested institutions in Washington. Debates over its funding, its enforcement practices, and its reach have turned the IRS into a symbol of something much larger than tax collection. For many Americans, it represents the question of how much authority the federal government should have over their finances. The Treasury Department sits at an even higher level. It is the agency responsible for managing the nation's overall financial operations, overseeing federal spending, managing national debt, and helping to shape the economic direction of the country. Treasury is deeply embedded in the structure of American governance, and decisions made there ripple through the broader economy. What has made both agencies particularly vulnerable to political scrutiny in recent years is a combination of funding battles, public trust issues, and an ongoing national conversation about the size and scope of federal power. Proposals to increase or cut IRS funding have become flashpoints in congressional debates, and questions about transparency and accountability at both agencies have intensified across the political spectrum. That context is exactly what makes this lawsuit so significant, because it doesn't just target these agencies, it targets the authority they represent. Now let's talk about the legal landscape, because understanding the framework here is critical to understanding just how unusual or how grounded this lawsuit actually is. At the heart of any legal action against a federal agency, there is a fundamental constitutional question. What are the boundaries of executive authority? The executive branch of the American government operates through agencies like the IRS and Treasury, and those agencies derive their power from legislation passed by Congress. That means there is an inherent tension built into the system. Agencies act on behalf of the executive, but their authority is ultimately defined and constrained by the legislative branch. When a lawsuit challenges agency conduct, it is essentially asking a court to evaluate whether that agency stayed within the legal boundaries it was given. Courts have a long history of weighing in on exactly these kinds of disputes. The principle that federal agencies can be held accountable for actions that exceed their statutory authority is well established in American jurisprudence. This is sometimes referred to as the doctrine of ultra vires. The idea that an action taken outside of one's legal authority is, by definition, invalid. There is also the matter of sovereign immunity, a legal doctrine that generally protects the federal government from being sued. However, Congress has created specific exceptions to this doctrine over the years, carving out pathways through which citizens and other parties can bring claims against federal agencies under defined circumstances. The Tucker Act, for example, is one such mechanism that allows certain financial claims to be brought against the United States in federal court. So the legal framework here is not without precedent. Courts have historically allowed challenges to agency conduct when those challenges are grounded in established legal authority. The central question in this case will not be whether such a lawsuit can exist, but whether the specific claims being made meet the legal standard required to move forward and ultimately succeed. As you would expect with any legal action of this magnitude, the political reaction has been immediate, and it has exposed some very clear fault lines. On one side of this debate, there are those who view the lawsuit as a necessary and legitimate form of accountability. From this perspective, challenging federal agencies that may have overstepped their authority is not just a legal right, it is a fundamental check on government power. Supporters of this position argue that if agencies like the IRS and Treasury have acted improperly, the only way to hold them accountable is through the courts. For lawmakers and commentators who hold this view, the lawsuit represents exactly the kind of institutional oversight the system was designed to allow. On the other side, critics have pushed back sharply. From their perspective, a lawsuit of this scale, targeting agencies that play a central role in funding and managing the federal government, raises serious concerns about the politicization of legal action. Some legal commentators have raised questions about whether the claims can withstand judicial scrutiny and whether the broader intent behind the filing is rooted in legitimate grievance or in political strategy. Administration officials and congressional figures have each staked out positions that align closely with their broader political priorities. This is not surprising. Disputes involving federal agencies and executive authority have long been flashpoints in the ongoing tension between the two major political parties. What makes this moment particularly notable is the speed and intensity of the reaction. Within days of the filing becoming public, both sides had already framed the narrative in ways that reflected deeper disagreements about the role of federal institutions, the limits of government authority, and who should ultimately be held accountable when agencies act. This is no longer just a legal story, it is a political one. Setting aside the politics for a moment, let's look at what this lawsuit actually signals about the direction American governance is heading, because the deeper story here is about power and who gets to define its limits. For decades, the relationship between the White House and federal agencies has operated within a broadly understood set of norms. Agencies like the IRS and Treasury are extensions of the executive branch. They carry out policy, enforce law, and manage critical financial systems on behalf of the federal government. But that relationship has always carried an inherent tension. The executive branch wants these agencies to act decisively. Congress wants them to stay within the boundaries of the law, and the courts sit in the middle as the final arbiter of where those boundaries actually fall. What this lawsuit introduces is a more direct and aggressive form of that tension. By seeking $10 billion in damages from agencies that are effectively arms of the executive branch itself, the filing raises a fundamental question. To what extent can federal institutions be held financially accountable for their actions? This is not a question American courts have had to grapple with in this way very often. Most disputes over agency conduct result in policy corrections or injunctions, not multi-billion-dollar damage claims. There is also a significant dimension here around taxpayer accountability. If a court were to entertain the premise of this lawsuit seriously, it would set a precedent that federal agencies are not insulated from financial liability in the way many have historically assumed. That could reshape how agencies operate internally, introducing a layer of financial risk into decisions that were previously made with the assumption of broad governmental immunity. Perhaps most significantly, this lawsuit signals a broader shift in how the relationship between the White House and its own agencies is being challenged. Traditionally, disputes over agency conduct have come from outside the executive branch, from Congress, from private citizens, or from advocacy groups. A lawsuit of this nature forces a reckoning with a more uncomfortable question. What happens when the challenge comes from within the political structures that created these agencies in the first place? That question has no easy answer, and it is one that American institutions will be forced to confront as this case moves forward. So who actually has the most to lose here? Because this lawsuit doesn't affect everyone equally, and identifying the key pressure points helps us understand exactly what is at stake. First, the agencies themselves. Both the IRS and the Treasury Department are now in the position of having to defend not only their actions, but their institutional credibility. If the claims in this lawsuit gain traction in court, it could force both agencies into a period of significant internal scrutiny, a process that would consume resources, divert attention from their core functions, and potentially erode public confidence in their ability to operate independently. Then there are the political figures on both sides of this debate. Lawmakers who have publicly aligned themselves with or against this lawsuit have now tied their political positioning to its outcome. If the case moves forward and gains momentum, it becomes a defining issue for those who championed it. And if it stalls or is dismissed, it becomes a vulnerability for the same individuals. Legal commentators and constitutional scholars are also watching closely, because the precedent set by this case, regardless of the final outcome, could reshape how future disputes between the executive branch and federal agencies are handled. The legal community has a direct stake in how courts interpret the boundaries of agency authority and financial liability. Finally, and perhaps most broadly, American taxpayers are affected. The IRS and Treasury manage the financial infrastructure that underpins the federal budget. Any prolonged legal battle involving these agencies introduces uncertainty, and uncertainty in institutions of this importance carries consequences that extend far beyond the courtroom. So where does this go from here? Because despite all the headlines and the political noise, the actual trajectory of this case will be determined by a very specific set of legal steps, and those steps take time. The first major hurdle is procedural. Before any court begins to evaluate the substance of the claims, the government will almost certainly challenge whether this lawsuit can even move forward. This is standard practice in cases involving federal agencies. The legal team defending the IRS and Treasury will likely argue that the claims fail to meet the basic requirements for standing, jurisdiction, or that sovereign immunity protections should apply. That alone could take months to resolve. If the case survives that initial stage, it enters a phase of discovery and motion, where both sides formally lay out their evidence and legal arguments. This is where the real substance of the $10 billion claim will be tested. Courts will examine whether the conduct described in the filing actually occurred as alleged, and whether it falls within the scope of actionable harm under existing law. Beyond that, there are broader procedural realities to consider. Federal litigation of this scale rarely moves quickly. Appeals, continuances, and procedural challenges can extend timelines significantly. It is entirely possible that the most consequential decisions in this case, the ones that will ultimately determine its outcome, are still months or even years away. The key decision points to watch are the initial jurisdictional rulings, any motions to dismiss, and whether the court agrees to allow the case to proceed to a full hearing. Each of those moments will signal whether this lawsuit has real staying power or whether it will quietly fade from public attention before it ever reaches a final resolution. This lawsuit may or may not succeed in court, But regardless of how it ends, it has already forced a conversation that American institutions cannot ignore. A conversation about accountability, about the limits of federal power, and about whether the systems designed to govern this country are still functioning the way they were intended to. That is a question that extends far beyond $10 billion. And it is one worth watching closely as this story continues to unfold.